panel for the day? Almost over. The summit is almost over. So the next panel will be looking at indexing architecture, which is all about researching, documenting, and preserving modern architecture heritage. We will have a UAE perspective on this, as well as a guest from the Royal Academy of Art. So, are we almost all right? So without further ado, let us all welcome the Assistant Undersecretary from the Ministry of Culture and Knowledge Development, Salem Al Qassimi, and the Head of Architecture from the Royal Academy of Arts, Kate Goodwin. Thank you.
Well, it's a real honour, Sheikh Salem, to be here talking to you. I wanted to start off by asking you, I see your part of your portfolio is arts and heritage within the Culture and Knowledge Development Ministry here, and I wondered how that had, architecture being a part of that particular government ministry, how that came about.
Thank you, Kate. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. I think first I want to thank DCT for this wonderful event. Each year we see it just elevated more and more, and the conversations are being just more interesting. Thank you for that question. It's a great question to start with. We worked on restructuring with the Ministry of Culture and Knowledge Development. And within arts and heritage, it was important for us to identify what we define as culture to be. And architecture is a significant topic that we believe needs to be discussed and looked into on a federal level. Previously, the Ministry of Culture always had an architectural arm, but it looked at, and we still look at, we look at archaeology and the need to preserve archaeology buildings. The first buildings that we have in the UAE come from date back more than the 1700s. So there's this very important key driver to sustain and maintain those heritage sites across the UAE. But we're talking about something slightly different here. We're talking about developing an architecture initiative that looks at preserving modern architecture heritage. And I think we're talking about it at the right time. And the initiative is being kicked off at the right time. We're all sort of starting to feel the nostalgic feeling towards buildings that were built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that are relatively very important for us to preserve and maintain. But not only to come up with policies to preserve those buildings, but also to look at the idea of documenting them, to look at the idea of ensuring that they're properly documented for several reasons. One, to put in the policy in place, to understand which buildings we need to be preserving across the UAE. But also number two, and something that I find extremely important, and I'm sure everyone here would agree, is to put that into the education program of architecture, which is another part of the driver of this initiative. So we're looking at documenting those buildings. We're looking at the need to preserve modern heritage buildings. Traditionally, that was always the job of municipalities, and it remains the job of municipalities across the Emirates or departments of planning. However, we're taking a look at it on a cultural perspective, and we feel that now is the time that's needed to preserve those buildings. Yeah. And I feel that we've been getting a lot of excitement of this project. There's a lot of nostalgic feeling that comes into this. I mean, a personal story of mine, I'm from Ras Al Khaimah, all the way north. And there was a roundabout that I used to drive back home as a child, and it was a clock tower that always reminded me of me being back home. It's gone now, and we need to make sure that nostalgic feeling of architecture is maintained. But Kate, I'd like to know from you, the Royal Academy of Arts. We're very happy to have you here in Abu Dhabi. If you can tell us more about the Royal Academy of Arts and the architecture initiatives that you've been working on.
I think what also sparked my first question is I think there's a real commonality with the idea that architecture is placed as part of culture. It's not part of a building industry just to produce these functional, practical things we inhabit. But architecture relates to so many, for me it's a social art. And I think that's, you started to allude to all of those aspects in what you've been laying out in talking. And I mean, the Royal Academy is an incredible place. It's 250 years old now. And when it was founded by artists and architects together. There was no distinction between that. And that's something that Farshid Musavi yesterday brought up. This binary distinction between the arts is something which is much more recent. So at the Academy, we've got this kind of mix of this artist and architect-led institution. And I see part of my role is, it's having a discussion about architecture and bringing it at one level, sort of being a bridge, talking to architects, being able to inspire them to think about how architecture isn't something that needs to be simply practical or functional, but actually can be elevated into the realm of ideas, into that of culture. It engages with social thinking, it engages with thinking about what the future might be, and that's a kind of bridge we can do. We can start to talk to practicing architects, to excite them about their profession, to aspire them to do something more, to understand that it is part of this bigger cultural conversation. And on the other side, to think about a public. We've got a really big, broad audience who's interested in art, they're interested in ideas, and actually that they don't see architecture as something separate, something that they just live in. It's actually so much part of everyday life. And as you say, it's that clock tower that you see that lifts your spirits and you know as you go home. There's something really distinct about those sorts of feelings that come about. And so we're trying to enhance knowledge about architecture so people feel as though they're equipped with the language to talk about it, understand its kind of historical context, but also how they relate to it on an everyday time. Absolutely. And so it's a whole series of programs we do. I mean, a lot of what we do is around programming, because it's a way, I think, architecture is very difficult to bring into a gallery. It's out there. So you can bring in the ideas around architecture and do that through big, major loan exhibitions. We just had a big exhibition with the architect Renzo Piano, at the same time of having a little project space which dealt with the idea of architecture and technology, with a bunch of young practitioners who are experimenting with what technology might mean for their work now, alongside an event program every Monday evening and awards. And I think for me, it's always about thinking about the ideas you have and how is the best format to kind of put them out as an outreach. Yes. And I think that's probably, it's really interesting to hear about these different ways in which you're thinking about your architectural heritage here across these educational aspects, which I appreciate are really important. So there's the educational aspect. There's publications as well.
Yes, well, we just, actually just before this talk, we announced the UAE Architecture Initiative. At the ministry, we believe that it's always important to collaborate with other entities. It's especially that we come on a strategic level, on a federal level. It's very important for us to tap into experts from different fields. So we launched the UAE Architecture Initiative, and within that initiative, it looks at education, it looks at research, it looks at documenting the importance of those buildings. So there's a whole wide range of different projects that fall under this UAE Architecture initiative that we're working on with the Department of Culture and Tourism, the Department of Planning Municipality, both of Abu Dhabi, as well as Zayed University. The specific most interesting one that I think would interest you, Kate, and a lot of people here is we have a lot of architecture programs in the UAE, but it's time for us to tailor an architecture program that specifically looks at UAE architecture, because we're at the right time for that. We need to understand the 60s movements, the 70s movements, the 80s when it comes to buildings that are existing here in the UAE. So we're tailoring a program, and we're working with Zayed University to come up with an architecture-tailored program that focuses on this mainly. I mean, we were having a conversation as well, and the last time you were here was 10 years ago. So I have to ask you this question as an architect, because I know architects, the second they get anywhere, the first thing they do is look at spatial planning, buildings, that sort of thing. What was your impression 10 years and the differences of what happened?
I've got to say, I've been very diligent and been at the summit for a lot of the time in the last 4 days, which has been wonderful. So I haven't seen as much as I would have liked to, but I'm struck by, it has changed a lot in that period of time. I can't quite remember where I am. I suddenly have moments where I come around and kind of go, yes, I remember being here then. But I'm struck by there's a lot of change, but actually the change feels as though it's happening at a pace that's marked, which
Right.
is really nice. And it was wonderful going to the Cultural Foundation on Monday evening. We were there and seeing that it's about, it's creating a building, but it's also creating an urban space in the centre of that city. And the preservation, or the kind of the scale of the buildings there, to me was really pleasing to see, actually. I thought it might have gone up more. You see clusters of buildings, but actually it feels as though there is a layering that's taking place here. And so you can sort of see those layers coming up. And I saw hints of some really interesting buildings in corners that weren't just towers. Actually, they were sort of scale that was different. So that was but I need to go and see more of what's here. But, we were at the Louvre last night, and it's an extraordinary building, actually, to see what it does as a symbol, as a sort of cultural space to bring, how it's laid out, how the building works with the curatorial ideas as it sort of moves around from pre-ancient to now. And it was a joy to see that, and actually to get that space of getting outside, which is such a nice thing. Actually, there's some wonderful spaces outside and between buildings.
Right. I'm curious to know what do you define modern architecture heritage to be? Because for us, we come from complete different places. The urban framework of, I know you're Australian, but you live in the UK, in London specifically. The urban fabric of London and cities here in the UAE are obviously extremely different. So what do you define modern heritage to be? And what can we learn from this definition?
I'm not sure. I mean, for me, I would put around the sort of modern movement. I think what's interesting here is the sort of the recentness of it. We were talking about how these buildings of the 60s and 70s are viewed, that in some ways they're sort of seen as ugly, or they're seen as something of the past. And I mean, I'm seeing a parallel discussion happening in the UK, actually, about how we revisit those buildings of the 60s and 70s, particularly in sort of some of the sort of brutalist architecture. We've got big estates there, and I live on quite a distinctive, big concrete estate in London, which 10 years ago was marred with a whole lot of social issues. It was seen to be ugly. Now, every time I leave the house, there's quite often architects, but there's a lot of cultural tourism coming to look at these buildings and appreciating them. And I think that's a really interesting thing about this initiative. And I think particularly the indexing thing is starting to say, what is our cultural heritage? How do we record it? How do we make it available for people to see and to understand? And there seems a lot of scope in those conversations to just look at it. I mean, you showed me a really interesting Instagram account of somebody who had started to document them. And I was in a taxi last night going back through the city, and you having showed it to me yesterday afternoon, I was suddenly looking at those facades differently. And in a graphic terms, I think it's really interesting, actually. We've been talking quite a lot at this summit about the role of technology, and it really is a really great way, particularly here, to link up different conversations and conversations between modernist buildings here and across the UAE, and the common dialogues that happens globally. And I think that there is real potential with the project that you're doing to continue those conversations, and that it is at one level an appreciation of what you have here, but it is always in dialogue. It's a local conversation that is and can be taken, elevated globally, and there's that relationship between the two that we're seeing actually throughout this week.
Yes. I think indexing is extremely. Sorry, just for the record, for everyone, the Instagram account that you were talking about is Hussein al-Musawi. I don't have his actual details, but we'll make sure that we'll find a way to share that. Very interesting account that pictures facades of different buildings in Abu Dhabi, specifically modern heritage buildings. But I wanted to talk about indexing. Part of our UAE initiative, UAE architecture initiative that we're launching is indexing. And what we mean by indexing is documenting research, feeding everything into a platform where real UAE architecture research is there and where everyone can access it. Academia, policymakers, architects, internationally or locally based. a sort of a platform for us to really enhance research within the UAE. And it's needed for architecture. It's very much needed. What are the best benchmarks that you've seen when it comes to documenting architecture, whether an index, a database, whatever it may be?
I think there's a number of organisations, particularly that look at 20th century. In the UK, we've got something like the 20th Century Society. There's Docomomo. There's numerous places around. But I think it's quite interesting to have understanding, thinking one about what you might do with the material, and then the sorts of things that you might gather. It seems important to understand what was driving those buildings, getting as much the information on the plans and the architects, the developers who was commissioning them, but the context in which they're taking place, the conversations that were happening at that moment. Because architecture is always responding to a condition, be that a physical one, a social one, a political one. There's something of its time that's quite interesting to see where it's located. And to unpick some of those things as, what was driving or making that architecture. So when people look at it, they can start to see where it's come from and what it might talk about for the future. Because I think these projects are as much about thinking about the future as they are about the past. They position you in it. And I was also, struck by you talking about this idea of nostalgia and your own relationship to the clock tower and some of, I know there's buildings around here, and actually picking up some of the oral history, and there's some very interesting projects around oral histories, and thinking about the kind of the social role that these buildings play in people's lives. And I think it can embed it in the kind of in a cultural discourse, these kinds of things. I think there's kind of amazing potential to do that, and then how you disseminate that, being able to listen to people. I mean, oral histories are always tricky because their accuracy relies upon someone's memory. But they're interesting for that context as well. And I think there's potential in those sorts of projects.
Absolutely. There's one question I have left for you. There's a lot we're learning from you, and I'm sure we're going to take this conversation offline for a long time. But you spoke about unpicking certain buildings. We're working on a publication for the Year of Tolerance called the Spaces of Coexistence. It looks at understanding architecture of spaces of cultural, where people come together, whether religious spaces, cultural spaces, recreational spaces, and looking at those on a UE level, again, specifically architecturally. And we have many. And so far we've had 400 locations that we scouted out and we identified, and each one is more interesting than the other. What do I unpick?
I think it's an amazing thing to gather, actually, when you and that reaching out. And I think for me sometimes the unpicking can also be who contributes to it. There seems to be a potential there to think, you can scout, asking people to think about the spaces that they inhabit every day, that are that sort of social, that is a bridge into a sort of public realm and discussion, is amazing. And I think then there's always a role of editing. I mean, I'm a curator, and every role of that is editing, what you bring to the fore, what the things you highlight in those discussions, and then how you put that into a publication. It sounds a really interesting book. But it's then how you edit it out, how you tell the stories of those places, because they're personal stories as well as they're spatial.
Yes.
And so I think for me it's probably unpicking the relationship between the social, the spatial, the architectural, and it sounds, the initiative sounds as though it's the start of something brilliant from which you will learn and develop and build upon. Yes. We'd promised to do questions,
yes.
And now realise that we've run quite enthusiastically together.
We have 2 minutes.
We've got 2 minutes to
Yes,
open up.
yes,
If other people have questions, comments, responses.
Yes, we've got a couple of questions. So one here, please. Okay, please, but please, very brief, because I thought he was going to ask first.
Well, thank you. I am very excited about this debate as former site manager. I've been working on architecture, urban architecture. And I am wondering if, in your case, you have the same problem I'm having. Because sometimes protected areas are being changed, okay? We have policy. Those policies, unfortunately, are not respected by elected people or by the state itself. in your case, did you have some one or two cities where you have, local material threatened by new ones? Is the architecture changing? If so, why? Who is changing the architecture? Thank you.
And you're asking for the UK
No,
perspective?
I think your perspective.
Yes. Yes.
Yours.
I mean, it's hard to answer those questions when you're not an architect. It's a very interesting question. I think the initiative that we're kicking off will address a lot of those topics, because at the end of the day, economics plays a big role. Land value plays a big role. At the end of the day, it makes sense to preserve some of those buildings, but sometimes it doesn't. And it's putting the right people together in a committee to come up with those decisions. But you don't put 10 architects together, 10 people who are advocates of modern heritage, because they want to save every single building that we have available. But I think what we need to do is mix and match between economists, between environmentalists, between socialists and architects all together to really understand the need of a building, whether it needs to be preserved or not, and the significance of that building.
Hi, I'm Hussein Mosawi. This convo makes my heart beat, by the way.
He's the Instagram guy,
Oh,
right?
yeah?
Yeah, I was.
Hussein, if you don't mind just sharing your Instagram tag.
Please go for it. Just a little question. My effort sort of comes from making sense of space as a designer, and possibly the question is to Kate. I'm building a typology with my documentation project, and was just wondering how is it possible to kind of trace the elements of the architectural styles in the UAE, because you have sort of modern Islamic architecture being blended with modernism and so many elements. And what I'm trying to do is to develop a typology of buildings here and a classification system. So I was just wondering what would be sort of a good way to start, because now I have different folders, I have some sort of tags with different kind of styles and such, but how would I sort of go about sort of understanding the influences in the country here and as a starting point?
Well, I think this is where the research project becomes such an important aspect of what's being done, to sort of understand the different knowledge bases that exist, to be able to draw them together. And it sounds, it's a wonderful account. And I learned quite a lot by just the quick look I had, and I can see that, you are drawing these stylistic lines. And I didn't understand the timeline of them all. And actually, this is where the research project really excites me, actually, because it does give the framework for these kinds of understandings that are obviously really necessary and good. So I think it's probably connecting you all together.
And for those interested, my account is Hography, @Hography, or on Instagram.
Thank you very much. I will try to put the Instagram on the screen for everybody to see. I'm not sure if we managed over there. Anyway, we've got another question. Alexa, please.
Hi, yes. So I was wondering if you think there is a future for alternate forms of archiving and digitization for structures and, I suppose, architecture, because I'm coming from it for a deep love of installations and space. So beyond just the facades, the actual interaction, and I was interested by the point of oral histories, because I think that also talks about the functionality of a building and what it means to a culture and people. So beyond just a 2D representation, do you think that there's a future for a different kind of archiving that may capture the totality of a space?
I think it also raises a really interesting question about how one thinks about how a building has changed over time as well. And I think that there could be a lot of scope for thinking about three-dimensional archiving, but also understanding how a building, we've just renovated a major building in London, and it was a building that was not fit for purpose within about 20 years. And over the course of 100 years, it had numerous occupants of different governments and people, and every occupant changed it for their own reason in different ways. And I think it's really interesting to understand how buildings aren't static, they evolve with use. And I think that's a very important discourse to come into this, actually, how people test it, they live with it differently. And I think that is part of this heritage, because you understand where it might go as well. You understand the potential of buildings if you understand their evolution. And I think that's, and then that gives you a sense of how you might think about whether it's preserved or how it's preserved, or what aspects of it might be retained, and whether everything has to be retained, or whether actually it can continue to be relevant. And I think that architecture shouldn't be held in a place that takes it away from still being a living part of our lives.
الشيخ سعود، الفرق بين المجتمعات الغربية مجتمع الإمارات العربية المتحدة، نحن الفرق عندنا في منطقتنا أن الشكل غير المحتوى. نحن دائما في المجتمعات الآخر يقول والله هذا قصر بريطانيا ولا من نحن نحافظ عليه، بس هو المحتوى، يعني هو الذكرى المعنوية للمكان. أعتقد نحن دولة الإمارات لازم نفكر أن هذا المكان له ذكرى أشخاص عاشوا فيه، ذكريات بشر. لو بناخذه كشكل أكيد الناس تقارنه دائما بالمجتمعات الأخرى، يعني كقصور مثلا نحن دولة حديثة من بدو إلى في الصحراء، ما في مكان موجود، بس هو ذكرى المكان. لازم احنا نحافظ على ذكرى المكان والأشخاص اللي عايشين فيه، على أساس مثل ما تفضلت النوستالجيا تبقى الحنين للمكان، مثل الدوار تفضلت عليه في أبو ظبي وفي الإمارات كلها. يعني هذا اللي نتمناه نحن، ذكرى للمكان، الأشخاص اللي عاشوا فيه، مثل ما سووا في الشارجة ما قصروا. أعتقد نحن متوجه، وزارة الثقافة متوجهة لتوجه صحيح يعني، وأشكركم على هل لحقتوا على البقايا الذكرى الموجودة، يعني ما قصرتوا يعني.